In the gleaming conference room of Hartwell Associates, a brilliant financial analyst was about to deliver the presentation of her career. What started as a routine merger analysis took a shocking turn when she came face to face with decades of systemic dismissal and casual cruelty. Madison Clarke wasn't your typical corporate climber. For 5 grueling years, she had spent her life fighting for respect in the cutthroat world of investment banking, known for her razor-sharp analytical mind and Harvard MBA credentials that meant nothing when measured against blonde hair and blue eyes. When she encountered her CEO's public humiliation in front of major clients, she had no idea she was sitting on the power to destroy everything he'd built. Madison's discovery of a forgotten family trust that would lead to the complete upheaval of corporate hierarchy and challenge everything she believed about justice versus revenge. What began as workplace harassment would become a calculated war for control. The financial district would never be the same after a woman dismissed as just another blonde revealed she owned 30% of the company that had spent years diminishing her worth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room felt like a stage, with Madison Clarke standing at the head of the polished mahogany table, her voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had spent 5 years perfecting this moment. The PowerPoint display behind her showed complex financial projections, each slide representing weeks of meticulous analysis. 3 potential clients sat across from her, executives from Meridian Holdings who controlled a portfolio worth $800 million. As you can see from our comparative analysis, Madison continued, her laser pointer highlighting key metrics, the synergies between your consumer electronics division and TechFlow's distribution network would generate an estimated 12% increase in quarterly revenues within the first 18 months post-merger. The lead client, Sarah Chen, leaned forward with interest. That's assuming optimal market conditions. What's your projection if we hit another supply chain disruption similar to what we saw in 2020? Madison smiled, anticipating the question. She'd modeled 17 different scenarios, including 3 separate crisis simulations. Excellent question. Even under adverse conditions, and I'm talking about a complete 6-month supply chain freeze, we're looking at a conservative 7% growth rate. Our sensitivity analysis shows. She clicked to the next slide, where color-coded charts displayed her contingency planning. The room's attention was locked on her presentation. She could feel it, that electric moment when complex financial strategy crystallized into something tangible and profitable. The risk mitigation strategies we've developed include diversified supplier networks across 4 different regions, with automated inventory rebalancing that can respond to disruptions within 72 hours. Madison's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent countless late nights stress-testing every assumption. Marcus Chen, seated along the wall with the other Hartwell analysts, watched with what looked like grudging admiration. Even James Hartwell, positioned near the back of the room, nodded as Madison walked through her projections. She caught his eye briefly, a flicker of something that might have been pride, or regret, or both. Now, if we examine the tax implications of the proposed structure, Madison transitioned seamlessly, her confidence building with each successful answer. This was her element. Numbers didn't lie, didn't diminish her because of her appearance, didn't interrupt her with condescending observations about her gender. The second client, David Morrison, raised his hand. What about the cultural integration challenges? We've seen deals like this fail because the 2 corporate cultures couldn't mesh. Madison had anticipated this too. Our analysis includes a comprehensive cultural assessment. TechFlow's decentralized management style actually complements Meridian's hierarchical structure rather than competing with it. We've identified 3 key integration points that would. I think that's enough detail for now. The voice cut through Madison's explanation like a blade. Richard Hartwell rose from his chair at the head of the table, his smile carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Madison's done a fine job with the number crunching," he continued, moving toward E, the presentation screen with the confidence of a man reclaiming his territory. "But let's talk about the real strategic implications here." Madison felt the shift in the room's energy like a physical blow. The client's attention moved from her detailed analysis to Richard's broader gestures, his practiced charm filling the space she had commanded moments before. "You see, what our young analyst here has laid out is all very thorough," Richard said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to make Madison's chest tighten. "But in my 30 years of experience, I've learned that the numbers only tell part of the story." The phrase, "our young analyst," hung in the air. Madison remained standing, her presentation remote still in her hand, suddenly feeling like an intruder in her own meeting. "The real question," Richard continued, positioning himself between Madison and the clients, "is whether TechFlow's leadership has the vision to execute on this kind of ambitious integration. Because frankly, I've seen a lot of pretty spreadsheets that looked great on paper but fell apart when reality hit." Sarah Chen glanced between Richard and Madison, clearly sensing the tension. "Ms. Clarke's analysis seems quite comprehensive, the risk modeling in particular." "Oh, Madison's always been thorough," Richard interrupted with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Detail-oriented to a fault. But sometimes you need someone with real strategic experience to see the forest for the trees." Madison felt the familiar burn of anger rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd swallowed countless times during client calls where male colleagues dismissed her insights, during strategy meetings where her ideas were credited to others, during performance reviews where her aggressive negotiation style was criticized, while similar behavior from men was praised as leadership. "The cultural integration challenges Mr. Morrison mentioned," she said, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her, "actually present the greatest opportunity for value creation. Our assessment shows." "You know what?" Richard's voice carried a casual cruelty that silenced the room. "Maybe we should let someone with a little more gravitas handle the strategic overview. No offense, Madison, but these gentlemen probably expect to hear from someone who's actually closed deals at this level." The words hit like a physical slap. Madison's presentation remote grew slick in her palm as she struggled to maintain her composure. Around the table, she saw the subtle signs of discomfort: James's jaw tightening, Elena Vasquez's sharp intake of breath from her seat near the door, Marcus Chen's careful study of his notes. But Richard wasn't finished. "I mean, let's be honest here," he said with a chuckle that made Madison's skin crawl. "These are serious business decisions. We need someone who commands real respect in these negotiations, not just another blonde with a Harvard MBA." The silence that followed was deafening. Madison felt the room's energy collapse around her. She saw Sarah Chen's eyebrows rise in shock, watched David Morrison shift uncomfortably in his seat. Even the third client, who had been checking his phone throughout the presentation, looked up with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Hartwell," Sarah Chen said carefully, "I think Ms. Clarke's analysis has been quite impressive." Of course," Richard waved dismissively. "Madison's very bright. But when you're talking about $800 million, you want someone who's been battle-tested, you know? Someone who's actually run point on deals this size." The phrase echoed in Madison's mind. Just another blonde. 5 years of proving herself, of working 18-hour days, of building models that had saved the company millions of dollars, all reduced to her hair color and gender in a single casual dismissal. She looked at James, hoping for some sign of support, but he was staring at his hands, his face flushed with what might have been shame or anger, or both. Marcus Chen continued to study his notes as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Only Elena Vasquez met her eyes, and Madison saw something there. Recognition, perhaps, or shared fury. Well, Madison said, her voice carrying a controlled calm that surprised even her. I think you have all the information you need to make an informed decision. She set down her presentation remote with deliberate care, gathered her portfolio from the table, and walked toward the door with measured steps. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Madison, Richard called out, his tone now carrying false warmth, as if he realized he might have gone too far. Don't be dramatic. You know I didn't mean anything by that. She paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle, and turned back to face the room. For a moment, she let herself really look at Richard Hartwell, at his expensive suit, his practiced smile, his casual assumption that his words would be forgotten, forgiven, or both. Of course not, she said evenly. You never do. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt more final than a slam. Madison walked down the hallway toward her office, her pace steady and professional despite the tremor in her hands. She nodded to Dot Morrison as she passed, the executive assistant's desk, noting the older woman's sharp, knowing look. Once inside her office, Madison closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to feel the full impact of what had just happened. Her carefully constructed professional facade cracked, revealing 5 years of accumulated rage and frustration. She moved to her desk and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Her family's attorney, a man she hadn't spoken to since her grandfather's funeral 3 years ago. Michael, she said when he answered, her voice steady again. It's Madison Clarke. I need to ask you about my grandfather's business papers, specifically anything relating to something called Hartwell Associates. The pause on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Madison, Michael's voice carried a note of surprise. I was wondering when you'd ask about that. Your grandfather made me promise not to bring it up unless you did first. How much do you know about his early business partnerships? Apparently, not nearly enough, Madison said, sinking into her desk chair. What exactly did he leave me? Not what, Madison? Where? Your grandfather wasn't just an investor in Hartwell Associates. He was Richard Hartwell's original partner. The trust he established holds 30% of the company's shares. You've been a major stakeholder since the day you started working there. The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She stared out her office window at the city skyline, processing the implications. 30%, in a firm that Richard Hartwell believed he owned outright. Madison, are you there? I'm here, she said softly. Michael, I need you to send me everything. Every document, every legal filing, every piece of paper related to that trust. Of course. But Madison, if you're thinking of asserting those rights, you need to be prepared for what comes next. This isn't just about money. This is about power. Madison looked at her reflection in the dark computer screen, at the face Richard Hartwell had dismissed as just another blonde, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Good, she said. It's about time. Marcus's hand lingered on the elevator button as Madison stepped inside, her composure intact, but her eyes carrying something different, a hardness that hadn't been there an hour ago. The meeting's aftermath still hung between them like smoke. Rough presentation, Marcus said carefully, testing the waters. Was it? Madison's voice held a note he'd never heard before. Not defeat, but something sharper, something calculating. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss, sealing them in silence until Marcus cleared his throat. Look, what Richard said back there. That was out of line. Everyone knows your analysis was solid. Madison studied his reflection in the polished steel doors. After 3 years of working alongside Marcus Chen, she knew his tells. The way he adjusted his tie when nervous, how his voice took on that particular cadence when he was trying to position himself advantageously. Right now, he was doing both. Everyone knows, she repeated, but no one said anything. The elevator chimed softly as they passed the 15th floor, Marcus shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. You know how it is. Richard's old school. He doesn't mean half the things he says. Just the other half, then? The doors opened on the 20th floor, and Madison stepped out without another word, leaving Marcus to contemplate his reflection alone. Her office felt different now, smaller somehow, despite the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. Madison closed the door and moved to her desk, her hands steady as she pulled out her phone. The contact list seemed foreign, as if she were looking at someone else's life. Michael Brennan, family attorney. She hadn't spoken to him since grandfather's funeral, when the reading of the will had felt like a formality wrapped in grief and expensive suits. Most of the estate had been straightforward: the house in Connecticut, some investment portfolios, personal effects divided among family members. But there had been mentions of business interests, trust funds, partnerships that seemed abstract at the time. "Michael," she said when he answered, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "It's Madison Clarke. I need to ask you about my grandfather's business papers, specifically anything relating to something called Hartwell Associates." The pause stretched so long, Madison wondered if the call had dropped. "Madison." Michael's voice carried a weight she hadn't expected. "I was wondering when you'd ask about that. Your grandfather made me promise not to bring it up unless you did first. He said you'd know when the time was right." "The time for what?" "To claim what's yours. Madison, your grandfather wasn't just an investor in Hartwell Associates. He was Richard Hartwell's original partner, the silent partner who provided the seed money, the business connections, the credibility that turned Richard's small accounting firm into what it is today." Madison sank into her chair, the city lights blurring beyond her window. "What exactly are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that the trust your grandfather established holds 30% of Hartwell Associates. You've been a major stakeholder since the day you started working there, and Richard Hartwell has no idea." The words hit like a physical force, rearranging everything Madison thought she knew about her place in the world. She thought about her grandfather, Thomas Clarke, the man who'd taught her to play chess on Sunday afternoons, who'd listened to her complaints about college professors who questioned her business aspirations, who died believing she would change the world. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. "Because he wanted you to earn your place on merit first. He said if you were truly his granddaughter, you'd prove yourself without relying on family connections. But he also said that when the world tried to diminish you for being who you are, you'd have the power to remind them who they were dealing with." Madison closed her eyes, remembering her grandfather's stories about the early days of his career, the handshake deals, the partnerships built on trust and vision. He'd spoken of Richard Hartwell as a young man with ambition but no capital, someone who'd needed guidance and financial backing to build something lasting. How much does Richard know about the original partnership agreement? That's where it gets interesting. The partnership was dissolved on paper in 1987, but your grandfather retained his equity stake through a series of trust transfers and shell companies. Richard thinks he bought him out completely, but legally, the shares were just moved into a family trust with you as the primary beneficiary. Madison pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes, her analyst's mind automatically organizing the information into actionable intelligence. "What kind of documentation do we have?" "Everything. Partnership agreements, stock transfers, board resolutions, trust documents. Your grandfather was meticulous about record keeping. He used to say that in business, the person with the best paperwork wins." As Michael spoke, Madison found herself remembering fragments of conversations from her childhood, her grandfather's casual mentions of watching Richard grow the company, his knowing smiles when she'd announced her intention to work in finance, his insistence that she keep detailed records of everything in her professional life. "He knew," she said suddenly. "He knew I'd end up working there. He hoped you would." He said Hartwell Associates needed someone with integrity to keep it honest, someone who understood that business was about more than just profit. Madison thought about the years she'd spent documenting every slight, every dismissive comment, every instance where her ideas had been stolen or her contributions minimized. She'd told herself it was professional paranoia, but now she wondered if some deeper instinct had been preparing her for this moment. Michael, I need you to send me everything. Every document, every legal filing, every piece of paper related to that trust. Of course. But Madison, if you're thinking of asserting those rights, you need to be prepared for what comes next. This isn't just about money. This is about power, and Richard Hartwell won't give it up without a fight. After ending the call, Madison sat in the gathering darkness of her office, processing the magnitude of what she'd learned. 30% ownership in a firm valued at over $200 million. Enough shares to block major decisions, to demand board representation, to fundamentally alter the company's direction. She opened her laptop and began pulling financial records, analyzing the company's performance over the past 5 years. As a senior analyst, she had access to most of the key metrics, and what she saw confirmed her suspicions. Hartwell Associates was profitable but stagnant, relying on old boy networks and established relationships rather than innovation or strategic growth. The sound of her office door opening made her look up. Dot Morrison stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable in the dim light from the hallway. "Working late again, dear?" Madison had always liked Dot, the executive assistant who seemed to know everything that happened in the company before it officially happened. But tonight, there was something different in the older woman's demeanor, a purposefulness that suggested this wasn't a casual check-in. "Just catching up on some research," Madison said carefully. Dot stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. "Research about family trusts, perhaps?" The question hung in the air between them. Madison felt her pulse quicken, wondering how much Dot actually knew. "I've been here 23 years, Dot continued, moving to the chair across from Madison's desk. "I started as a temp when Richard was still building this place from nothing. I remember the early days, when your grandfather used to come by for meetings." "You knew my grandfather?" Thomas Clarke was a gentleman, always treated everyone with respect, from the partners down to the cleaning staff. Very different from some people. Dot's expression hardened slightly. "He used to ask about you, you know. Once you started working here, wanted to know if you were being treated fairly, if you were getting the opportunities you deserved." Madison leaned forward, sensing there was more to this conversation than casual reminiscence. "What else do you remember about those early days?" Dot smiled, but it wasn't entirely pleasant. "I remember a lot of things. I remember Richard promising your grandfather that this would be a company built on merit, where the best ideas would win regardless of who suggested them. I remember him saying that he'd never let politics or prejudice influence business decisions." The implication was clear. Madison had been watching Richard break those promises for years, but apparently, she hadn't been the only one keeping track. "Dot, are you telling me you've been documenting? I'm telling you that some of us have been waiting a very long time for someone with the courage to demand better." Dot reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. "Your grandfather asked me to give this to you when the time came. He said you'd know when that was." Madison took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written across the front in her grandfather's distinctive handwriting, along with a date. Today's date, from 3 years ago. Inside, she found a handwritten letter and several legal documents. The letter was brief, but devastating. "My dear Madison, if you're reading this, then Richard has finally shown you who he really is. I had hoped he would prove me wrong, but I suspected this day would come. The documents in this envelope represent more than just business interests. They represent a promise that merit will matter more than appearance, that intelligence will matter more than politics, and that you will never have to accept being diminished by small men with large egos. The choice of what to do with this power is yours. I trust you to use it wisely. Your grandfather, Thomas Clarke. The legal documents were even more revealing, detailed records of Richard's promises to her grandfather, board meeting minutes from the early years outlining the company's founding principles, and documentation of how far the firm had strayed from its original mission. Madison looked up to find Dot watching her with keen interest. He was a wise man, your grandfather. He knew that power without preparation is useless, but preparation without power is meaningless. Now you have both. What do you think I should do? Dot's smile was sharp as a blade. I think you should remind Mr. Hartwell that some blondes are smarter than he gives them credit for. After Dot left, Madison sat alone with the documents spread across her desk like battle plans. The weight of possibility pressed down on her, the chance to transform not just her own career, but the entire culture of the company, to prove that intelligence and integrity could triumph over entitlement and prejudice. But she also understood the risks. Asserting her ownership rights would mean war, legal, professional, and personal. Richard Hartwell wouldn't surrender quietly, and the collateral damage could be significant. As the clock on her wall chimed 9 o'clock, Madison made her decision. She reached for her phone and scrolled to another contact, Elena Vasquez, the company's chief legal counsel. If she was going to challenge the established order, she would need allies who understood both the law and the stakes involved. The game had changed, but Madison Clarke was no longer playing by Richard Hartwell's rules. Elena Vasquez was still at her desk when Madison's text arrived at 9:15 p.m. Legal question about client account structures. Coffee tomorrow. It's urgent. The chief legal counsel stared at the message, noting the timestamp and the careful wording. In 5 years of working with Madison, she'd never known the analyst to reach out after hours unless something significant was brewing. Elena had witnessed the afternoon's board meeting disaster, had seen the way Richard's casual cruelty had landed like a physical blow, and she suspected this legal question was anything but routine. Elena typed back, Café Moderne, 7 a.m. Order me the usual. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching Elena's mood as she navigated the early commuter crowds. She'd spent a restless night thinking about Madison's message, wondering if she was finally ready to act on what Elena had suspected for months, that someone with Madison's documentation habits and analytical mind wouldn't tolerate Richard's behavior indefinitely. Madison was already seated at a corner table when Elena arrived, her usual coffee untouched and her laptop closed. The careful positioning, back to the wall, clear view of the entrance, told Elena this conversation would be unlike any they'd had before. You look tired, Elena observed, settling into the opposite chair. I've been up reading legal documents. Madison's voice carried a weight Elena hadn't heard before. Specifically documents about trust law and corporate governance. Elena sipped her cappuccino, studying Madison's face. The younger woman's composure was perfect, but there was something electric in her stillness, the focused calm of someone who'd reached a decision and was now calculating next moves. Trust law is complex, Elena said carefully, particularly when it involves family assets and corporate structures. What about when it involves silent partnerships and equity stakes that certain parties might not be aware of? The question hung between them like a challenge. Elena set down her cup, recognizing the moment for what it was, a test of loyalty, discretion, and courage. That would depend on the specific legal structures involved, Elena replied, and whether all parties have been properly informed of their rights and obligations. Madison opened her laptop and turned it toward Elena. The screen displayed a scanned document, a partnership agreement dated 1983, with 2 signatures at the bottom, Richard Hartwell and Thomas Clarke. Elena's breath caught. She'd heard rumors about the company's founding, whispered stories about outside investors and early partnerships, But she'd never seen documentation. Her legal mind immediately began processing the implications. "Madison," she said quietly, "where did you get this?" "My grandfather's files, along with these." Madison produced the manila envelope, spreading additional documents across the small table. Trust agreements, stock transfer records, board resolutions, a paper trail that painted a very different picture of Hartwell Associates' ownership. Structure. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she examined the documents. Her law degree from Stanford had prepared her for complex corporate disputes, but this was beyond complex. This was explosive. "Do you understand what you're showing me?" Elena whispered. "I understand that I own 30% of the company that spent 5 years treating me like an intern." Madison's voice remained steady, but Elena caught the undercurrent of controlled fury. "I understand that Richard Hartwell has been making decisions about my career while having no idea I could outvote him on board matters." Elena looked around the cafe, ensuring no one was within earshot. "Madison, if these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, you're not just talking about a harassment complaint or a wrongful termination suit. You're talking about a corporate revolution." "Good." Madison began gathering the papers, her movements precise and deliberate. "Because I'm tired of evolution." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a combination of fear and exhilaration that reminded her why she'd gone to law school in the first place. Not to enable corporate cover-ups or draft carefully worded non-disclosure agreements, but to ensure justice prevailed over politics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "What do you need from me?" Elena asked. Madison's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. "I need someone who understands corporate law well enough to help me assert my rights properly. Someone who's tired of watching competent women get dismissed by incompetent men." "And what makes you think I'm that someone?" Madison pulled out her phone and opened a voice recording app. "Because 3 months ago, you filed a preliminary complaint with the EEOC about patterns of workplace discrimination at Hartwell Associates. Because you've been quietly documenting hostile work environment incidents for the past 18 months. Because you've been waiting for someone with enough power to do something about it." Elena's coffee grew cold as she stared at Madison with new eyes. "How did you know about the EEOC filing?" "Because I've been paying attention. And because yesterday, when Richard made his blonde comment, you were the only person in that room who looked like you wanted to strangle him." Madison leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Elena, we both know that company is built on systematic discrimination. The question is whether we're going to keep enabling it or start fighting it." The weight of years of suppressed frustration crashed over Elena like a wave. She thought about the qualified female candidates whose resumes had been dismissed without consideration, the client meetings where she'd watched capable women analysts get talked over by less knowledgeable male colleagues, the performance reviews, where she'd been advised to be less aggressive in her legal opinions. "If we do this," Elena said slowly, "if we challenge Richard's authority directly, there's no going back. He'll fight us with everything he has. Let him fight." Madison's eyes held no trace of doubt. "I've got better lawyers than he does." Elena laughed despite herself, a sound that carried equal parts nervousness and anticipation. "You realize you're asking me to help you stage a corporate coup? I'm asking you to help me enforce existing legal agreements and ensure compliance with federal employment law." Madison's response was immediate and precise. "Everything else is just consequences." Elena studied the documents again, her legal mind cataloging the various challenges and opportunities they represented. "We'll need more than just your ownership stake. Richard has allies on the board, relationships with major clients, institutional knowledge about company operations. Which is why we need allies of our own." "Who did you have in mind?" Madison glanced toward the cafe's entrance where a familiar figure was approaching their table. Dot Morrison moved through the morning crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades navigating corporate environments. "I hope you don't mind," Madison said as Dot reached their table. "I asked Dot to join us." Elena's surprise must have shown on her face because Dot smiled as she settled into Reich, the third chair. "Elena, dear, you look like you've seen a ghost." "More like a revolution," Elena replied faintly. Dot's smile widened. "Oh, that. Yes, well, some of us have been waiting quite a while for this particular revolution." She opened her purse and pulled out a thick folder. 23 years of waiting, to be precise. Elena watched in fascination as Dot spread the folder's contents across the table. Personnel files, email printouts, recorded meeting transcripts, documented instances of discriminatory behavior, a comprehensive record of corporate misconduct that spanned decades. "Dot," Elena breathed. "This is thorough?" "Yes. I pride myself on thoroughness." Dot's voice carried a satisfaction that made Elena think of a chess master revealing a long-planned strategy. You'd be surprised how much people reveal when they think you're just part of the furniture. Madison leaned back in her chair, and Elena realized she was watching a carefully orchestrated presentation. This wasn't a spontaneous alliance. It was a recruitment meeting. "How long have you two been planning this?" Elena asked. "Since yesterday afternoon," Madison replied. "When I realized that documentation without action is just very expensive filing." Dot nodded approvingly. "And action without proper legal counsel is just very expensive litigation." Elena felt the last of her resistance crumble. She looked at the two women across from her, one armed with ownership rights and burning ambition, the other wielding decades of accumulated evidence and institutional knowledge, and recognized something she'd been searching for throughout her entire legal career: the chance to be on the right side of history. "All right," she said, her voice steadying with resolve. "Let's talk strategy." For the next hour, they outlined their approach, with the precision of generals planning a campaign. Elena would review all legal documentation to ensure their claims were bulletproof, while beginning preliminary research into board governance procedures and shareholder rights. Dot would continue her intelligence gathering while identifying potential allies among the staff and junior partners. Madison would maintain her normal work routine while preparing for the inevitable confrontation. "One more thing," Elena said as they prepared to leave. "We need to consider the possibility that Richard might have allies we don't know about. Board members, major clients, investors who might prefer the status quo." Madison smiled, the expression of someone who'd already considered every angle. "Actually, I think we might have some surprising allies in that area." "Such as?" "Well, for starters, I suspect Victoria Hartwell isn't as loyal to her husband as people assume." Elena's eyebrows rose. Richard's wife had always been a mystery, sophisticated, intelligent, but seemingly content to remain in the background of company social events. "What makes you think that?" "Because yesterday, when Richard made his blonde comment, she was watching from the conference room doorway." Madison gathered her laptop and documents, and she didn't look amused. As they walked back toward, say, the office building, Elena felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that preceded every major legal challenge. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for a client. She was fighting for the principle that competence should matter more than connections, that merit should triumph over prejudice. "Elena," Madison said as they approached the building's entrance, "there's something else you should know." "What's that?" "My grandfather didn't just leave me ownership documents. He left me a letter." Madison's voice carried a note of steel that made Elena's spine straighten. "He said the choice of what to do with this power was mine, that he trusted me to use it wisely." Elena studied Madison's profile as they entered the building's marble lobby. "And what do you consider wise?" Madison's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. reminding certain people that some blondes are a lot more dangerous than they look. As the elevator doors closed around them, Elena realized she was no longer just Madison's legal counsel. She was part of something larger, more significant than either of their individual careers. They were about to challenge an entire system of institutional discrimination, armed with nothing but legal documents, accumulated evidence, and the righteous fury of women who'd been underestimated for far too long. The war had officially begun. The first rule of corporate warfare, Madison had learned from her grandfather's chess lessons, was to understand the battlefield before making your first move. 3 days after the cafe meeting with Elena and Dot, she began what she privately called her reconnaissance phase, careful, systematic intelligence gathering disguised as routine workplace interactions. Thursday morning found her in the break room at 7:30, timing her arrival to coincide with the early shift of administrative staff. She'd learned years ago that the real pulse of any organization could be found in these informal moments, when people dropped their professional guards and revealed what they actually thought about company leadership. "Morning, Sarah," Madison said to the accounts receivable clerk, a woman in her 40s who'd been with the company for nearly a decade. "Oh, hi, Madison. You're here early." Sarah's smile was genuine but tired. "Heard about your presentation on Tuesday. Sorry it didn't go better." Madison poured herself coffee, noting how quickly news traveled through the administrative network. "These things happen. How are things in your department?" "Same as always. Too much work, not enough recognition." Sarah lowered her voice instinctively, glancing toward the executive offices. "Though between you and me, some of us are getting tired of the way things work around here." "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "You know how Mr. Hartwell always talks about rewarding performance? Well, Janet in HR has been tracking promotion patterns for the past 5 years. Guess how many women have been promoted to senior positions during that time?" Madison knew the answer. She'd run the same analysis herself. But she let Sarah continue. 2 out of 37 promotions, and both of those were lateral moves, not actual advancement. Sarah's voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd watched competent colleagues passed over repeatedly. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen gets fast-tracked after 3 years, and that new guy in derivatives, what's his name, Bradley? He's already being talked about for junior partner. Madison filed the information away, noting how Sarah's frustration could potentially be channeled into support for organizational change. "That does seem disproportionate." "Disproportionate?" Sarah laughed humorlessly. "That's a polite way of putting it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Chen himself, looking impeccable in his tailored suit and carrying the confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether his gender would affect his career trajectory. "Ladies," he said with practiced charm, moving to the coffee machine. "Early morning strategy session?" Madison watched his body language, noting how he positioned himself to dominate the space despite being the newcomer to the conversation. "Just catching up on departmental news. Sarah was telling me about some interesting promotion statistics." Marcus's smile flickered, just barely, but Madison caught it. "Statistics can be misleading. Merit-based decisions aren't always easy to quantify." "Interesting perspective," Madison replied evenly. "I've always found that numbers tell pretty clear stories when you know how to read them." Sarah excused herself with obvious discomfort, leaving Madison and Marcus alone in the increasingly tense atmosphere of the break room. "You know," Marcus said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. "I've been thinking about Tuesday's meeting. Richard can be direct in his communication style." Madison recognized the opening for what it was, Marcus testing her reaction, trying to gauge whether she represented a threat to his own ambitions or an opportunity to advance them. "Direct is one word for it," she said. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "in this business, relationships matter as much as competence. Richard has connections that go back decades: client relationships, board relationships, industry relationships. Someone challenging that network would need to be very careful about how they proceeded. The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Madison smiled, allowing a hint of steel to enter her voice. Good thing I've always been careful about my relationships, too. Marcus studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to read between the lines. Madison could see him calculating, weighing his loyalty to the existing power structure against the potential benefits of aligning himself with someone who might represent change. Madison, he said finally, if someone were hypothetically considering organizational changes, they'd want to make sure they had sufficient support before making any moves. Hypothetically speaking, Madison replied, someone in that position would probably want to know who else might be interested in those same changes. They stood in silence for a moment, the coffee machine's gentle hum filling the space between them. Madison could see Marcus wrestling with competing loyalties and ambitions, his analytical mind running through scenarios and potential outcomes. There might be others, he said carefully. People who've noticed the same patterns you and Sarah were discussing. People who think merit should matter more than other factors. That's interesting to know, Madison said. Hypothetically. Marcus nodded slowly, then straightened his tie, his tell for having reached a decision. You know where to find me if you want to continue this conversation. After he left, Madison remained in the break room, processing the interaction. Marcus's willingness to even hint at dissatisfaction suggested her position might be stronger than she'd initially calculated. If someone as ambitious and politically minded as Marcus was questioning the current leadership, other potential allies might be waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Conference room B, 15 minutes. Brought reading material. Madison made her way to the small conference room Elena had reserved, finding the lawyer already seated with several thick folders spread across the table. Elena looked up as Madison entered, her expression mixing excitement with apprehension. Tell me you have good news, Madison said, closing the door behind her. I have complicated news, Elena replied, which might be better than good news, depending on how you look at it. Elena opened the first folder, revealing a comprehensive analysis of the company's board structure, voting procedures, and governance protocols. I've been reviewing the corporate bylaws, and your ownership position is even stronger than we initially thought. Madison settled into the chair across from Elena, studying the documents. How so? The original partnership agreement included some very specific provisions about board representation and voting rights. Your grandfather wasn't just a silent partner, he negotiated veto power over major corporate decisions. Elena's finger traced a highlighted section of text. Any transaction over $10 million, any change in executive compensation, any modification to company policy regarding employee advancement. All of these require approval from shareholders, representing at least 35% of outstanding shares. Madison felt a surge of satisfaction. And I control 30%. Exactly. Which means you only need to find one other board member willing to support your positions, and you can effectively control company policy. Who are the current board members? Elena flipped to another document. Richard obviously holds the chairman position. Then there's Victoria Hartwell with 15%, James with 10%, and 3 outside directors with smaller stakes. The interesting thing is that Victoria's shares were part of her divorce settlement negotiations. Madison's eyebrows rose. Divorce settlement? They've been separated for 6 months. Very quietly, very discreetly, but the legal filings are there if you know where to look. Elena's smile was grim. Apparently, Richard's behavior isn't limited to workplace interactions. What kind of settlement are we talking about? Victoria is asking for half of everything, including her current board position and an additional 10% of company shares. She's also demanding that any future major decisions require spousal approval, which effectively means she wants veto power over Richard's business choices. Madison leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. So Victoria already has motivation to oppose Richard, and if she gets what she's asking for, she'd control 25% of the company, which, combined with your 30%, would give you controlling interest. Elena's voice carried a note of amazement. Madison, you wouldn't just be challenging Richard's authority, you could completely remove him from power. The weight of possibility settled over Madison like a heavy cloak. She'd been thinking in terms of forcing changes, demanding respect, proving her competence. But Elena was describing something far more comprehensive, the complete transformation of the company's leadership structure. There's more, Elena continued, opening another folder. I've been researching Richard's client relationships, trying to understand where his power base really lies. What I found is interesting. Elena spread out a series of financial reports and client analysis sheets. Hartwell Associates has been losing major clients steadily for the past 3 years. The Meridian Holdings account that was the subject of Tuesday's presentation, that's make or break for the company's quarterly numbers. Madison studied the figures, her analyst's training automatically identifying the troubling patterns. We're more vulnerable than people realize. Much more vulnerable. Richard's been using creative accounting to hide the declining revenue, shifting money between accounts to make the books look healthier than they actually are. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. Madison, if these numbers are accurate, the company could be in serious financial trouble within 12 months, unless something changes dramatically. What kind of changes? New leadership, new client acquisition strategies, new policies that attract and retain top talent instead of driving it away. Elena met Madison's eyes across the table. The kind of changes that could only be implemented by someone with both the vision to see what needs to be done and the power to make it happen. Madison felt the final pieces of her strategy clicking into place. This wasn't just about personal vindication or workplace justice. It was about saving a company that Richard's leadership was slowly destroying. Her grandfather's investment, the livelihoods of dozens of employees, the future of an institution that could be great if properly managed. Elena, she said slowly, I need you to arrange a meeting with Victoria Hartwell. I can try, but she's been avoiding the office since the separation became public knowledge. Then we'll meet her somewhere else, somewhere private, where she can speak freely about her plans for the company's future. Madison gathered the documents, her movements sharp with renewed purpose. Because I think it's time Mrs. Hartwell learned that she's not the only one interested in changing the current management structure. Elena nodded, already reaching for her phone. I'll make some calls. As Madison walked back to her office, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. She'd begun this journey seeking justice for a single incident of workplace harassment. But reconnaissance had revealed something larger, a systematic pattern of discrimination and financial mismanagement that threatened the entire organization. Her grandfather had left her more than ownership shares and legal documents. He'd left her the opportunity to prove that competence and integrity could triumph over entitlement and prejudice, that a woman dismissed as just another blonde could save a company that its current leadership was destroying through arrogance and incompetence. The reconnaissance phase was complete. Now it was time to begin building the coalition that would transform Hartwell Associates forever. Madison was reviewing quarterly projections when the knock came at her office door. 3 soft raps followed. By a pause, then 2 more. The pattern was familiar, a private signal from years ago when stolen moments and careful timing had mattered more than quarterly earnings reports. Come in, she said, not looking up from her laptop screen. James Hartwell stepped into her office, closing the door behind him with the same careful precision she remembered from their brief relationship 2 years ago. He looked older somehow, the boyish charm that had first attracted her now tempered by something that might have been wisdom or might have been weariness. "I was hoping we could talk," he said, his voice carrying none of his father's commanding certainty. Madison saved her work and closed the laptop, giving him her full attention. "About what?" "About Tuesday. About my father's behavior. About us." James moved to the chair across from her desk, but didn't sit, instead running his hand through dark hair that had clearly been styled that morning, but was now showing signs of nervous manipulation. "I know things ended badly between us, but I need you to know that what he said was completely unacceptable." The apology hung in the air between them, sincere but inadequate. Madison studied James's face, noting the genuine distress in his blue eyes that shared his father's color but none of his cold calculation. "Your father has been saying unacceptable things for years," Madison replied evenly. "Tuesday wasn't an aberration, James. It was just the first time he said it in front of clients." James finally sat down, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I know, and I know I should have said something, should have stood up to him then and there. I've been thinking about it for days, replaying that moment and hating myself for staying silent." Madison felt a familiar tug of sympathy, the same vulnerability that had drawn her to James initially, before she'd learned that good intentions were meaningless without the courage to act on them. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "Stand up to why? Him, I mean." "Because I'm a coward." The admission came out flat and matter-of-fact. "Because it's easier to disapprove quietly than to challenge him publicly. Because I've spent my whole life being Richard Hartwell's son instead of figuring out who James Hartwell actually is." Madison recognized the honesty in his words, but she also heard something else, the self-awareness of someone who was tired of his own compromises. "Is that why you asked to see me? To apologize for being a coward?" "Partly." James leaned forward, his voice taking on a quality she hadn't heard since their relationship ended. "But mostly because I miss you, miss us, miss having someone in my life who isn't impressed by the Hartwell name or afraid of my father's temper." The confession hit Madison with unexpected force. She'd spent 2 years telling herself that their breakup had been inevitable, that the complications of dating the boss's son would have eventually destroyed any chance they'd had at happiness. But sitting across from James now, seeing the genuine regret in his eyes, she felt the old pull of attraction mixed with something more dangerous, hope. "James," she said carefully, "a lot has changed since we broke up. I know. I know I hurt you when I chose family loyalty over standing up for what was right. I know I let my father's opinions influence how I saw our relationship." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "But I also know that you were the best thing in my life, and I was an idiot to let fear destroy it." Madison felt the careful walls she'd built around her emotions beginning to crack. The timing couldn't be worse. She was in the middle of planning what amounted to a corporate coup against James's father, armed with information that would destroy everything James thought he knew about his family's business. "What are you asking? Me, exactly?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to try again. Dinner, maybe. Somewhere we can talk without worrying about office politics or family complications." James's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'm asking if you think two people who care about each other can find a way to navigate the mess our families and careers have created." The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was James, offering her exactly what she'd wanted 2 years ago, a relationship free from the complications of corporate hierarchy and family pressure. And she was about to use information that would destroy his father's career, possibly his family's financial security, and certainly any chance they might have had at a future together. "There's something you should know," Madison said slowly, "about why your father's behavior is so problematic. beyond just the obvious issues of workplace harassment. James's expression grew serious. What do you mean? Madison weighed her options carefully. She could lie, deflect, postpone this conversation until after she'd made her move against Richard. She could protect James from the knowledge that would inevitably hurt him. Or she could trust him with the truth and hope that his recent self-awareness extended to understanding why she had to act. Your father isn't just creating a hostile work environment, she said finally. He's driving the company toward financial ruin. His management style isn't just morally wrong, it's economically disastrous. James frowned, clearly not expecting the conversation to take this direction. What are you talking about? The company's been profitable for years. On paper, yes. But we've been losing major clients steadily for the past 3 years. The profit margins are artificially inflated through creative accounting, and if the trends continue, Hartwell Associates will be in serious financial trouble within 12 months. How do you know this? Madison hesitated, realizing she was approaching dangerous territory. Because I've been analyzing the numbers. Because part of my job involves understanding the company's financial position. And because I care about what happens to this place. James stood up and began pacing, his agitation obvious. Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, what does that have to do with my father's comment on Tuesday? Because his behavior is part of the problem. He's creating an environment where talented people leave, where discrimination is tolerated, where merit matters less than personal relationships. Madison kept her voice steady, but she could feel the conversation slipping away from her. Companies that operate that way don't survive in competitive markets. So what are you suggesting? That we stage some kind of intervention? Convince him to change his management style? Madison looked at James, really looked at him, and saw the fundamental divide between them. He was thinking in terms of family dynamics and personal relationships. She was thinking in terms of corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility. I'm suggesting that sometimes change requires more than good intentions and family conversations. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. James stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. Madison, what aren't you telling me? She met his eyes, seeing in them the same intelligence and decency that had attracted her initially. But she also saw the limitations that had ultimately driven them apart. The inability to fully separate personal loyalty from professional responsibility. I'm telling you that this company needs new leadership. I'm telling you that your father's approach to business is ultimately going to destroy everything your family has built. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And I'm telling you that I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen. James sank back into his chair, his face pale. You're talking about challenging my father directly. I'm talking about doing what's necessary to save this company. Even if it means destroying my family? The question hung in the air between them like a sword. Madison felt the weight of all her careful planning, all her grandfather's hopes, all her own years of suppressed ambition and documented humiliation. James, she said softly, your father destroyed our relationship 2 years ago when he made it clear that dating you was a threat to my career advancement. He's been destroying this company for years with his discriminatory practices and financial mismanagement. At some point, you have to ask yourself who's really responsible for the destruction. James stared at her for a long moment, and Madison could see him processing the implications of what she'd said. The recognition that she wasn't just upset about Tuesday's incident, that she was planning something much more comprehensive and potentially devastating. Is this about revenge? He asked quietly. About getting back at him for what he's done to you? Madison considered the question seriously. It's about justice, about accountability, about ensuring that competence matters more than connections and that discrimination has consequences. And if those consequences include destroying the career of the man who's been my father for 29 years, then maybe you need to ask yourself why protecting him matters more than protecting the dozens of employees whose careers he's damaged, or the company that your grandfather helped build. James winced at the reference to his grandfather, a man he'd idolized but whom Madison now knew had been Richard's original partner, the source of both the company's initial capital and its founding principles. "Madison," James said finally, his voice carrying a note of desperation, "whatever you're planning, whatever you think you can accomplish, please consider the cost, not just to my father, but to everyone who'll be caught in the crossfire." Madison felt her heart breaking a little, but her resolve remained firm. "I have considered the cost, James. I've been considering it for 5 years. The question is whether you're finally ready to consider it too." She stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the city skyline. "You asked me to dinner, to try again, to find a way past the complications. But the complications aren't external, James. They're not something we can navigate around or wait for them to resolve themselves." "What are you saying?" Madison turned back to face him, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "I'm saying that you're going to have to choose between supporting a system that's fundamentally broken or supporting the changes necessary to fix it, between protecting your father's reputation or protecting the principles that should guide how business is conducted." James stood slowly, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "And us? What happens to any chance we might have had?" Madison smiled sadly, feeling the weight of paths not taken and futures that might have been. "That depends entirely on what choice you make." After James left, Madison sat alone in her office, staring out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as evening approached. The conversation had confirmed her worst fears, that James, despite his good intentions and genuine regret, would ultimately choose family loyalty over institutional change. But it had also clarified something important about her own motivations. This wasn't about revenge, despite what James might think. It was about transformation, of herself, of the company, of the systems that allowed discrimination and incompetence to flourish unchallenged. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Victoria Hartwell agreed to meet. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., her lawyer's office. Says she has information that might interest us." Madison smiled, feeling the pieces of her strategy continuing to fall into place. James might not be ready to choose sides, but apparently his mother was. The personal complications would have to wait. The war for Hartwell Associates was about to begin. The law offices of Kellerman, Walsh & Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, the kind of place where million-dollar divorces were negotiated over single malt scotch and handwritten notes worth more than most people's annual salaries. Madison stepped off the elevator into a reception area that whispered wealth and discretion, Persian rugs over polished marble, original artwork that belonged in museums, and furniture that had probably been crafted by European artisans whose families had been making chairs for royalty for generations. Elena emerged from the elevator behind her, carrying a leather briefcase that contained the most important documents of Madison's life. They had spent the morning preparing for this meeting, reviewing strategy and anticipating questions, but nothing could have prepared Madison for the gravity of what they were about to attempt. "Mrs. Hartwell is waiting in conference room A," the receptionist said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone accustomed to facilitating sensitive conversations. "Mr. Walsh will be joining you shortly." Madison followed the receptionist down a hallway, lined with portraits of distinguished legal minds, men in expensive suits whose stern expressions seemed to judge her audacity in challenging the established order. But today, she drew strength from their disapproval. Her grandfather had taught her that true success was measured not by the approval of powerful men, but by the courage to do what was right, regardless of their opinions. Victoria Hartwell was seated at a conference table that could have hosted peace negotiations between warring nations, her posture elegant despite the obvious strain of recent months. She wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Madison's monthly salary, but her carefully applied makeup couldn't entirely hide the exhaustion in her eyes. "Ms. Clarke, Ms. Vasquez," Victoria said, rising to shake their hands. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here. I thought it would be best if we could speak somewhere." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Where we could be completely honest." Madison studied Victoria's face, noting the intelligence behind her composed exterior. This was not the decorative wife she'd always assumed. This was a woman who had clearly been thinking strategically about her situation for quite some time. "Mrs. Hartwell," Madison said, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Elena mentioned that you might have information relevant to our situation." Victoria's laugh was bitter. "Oh, I have information. The question is whether you're prepared for what you're going to hear." A knock at the door interrupted them, and Thomas Walsh entered, a distinguished man in his 60s whose reputation for handling high-profile divorces was legendary in legal circles. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen every possible permutation of human greed, betrayal, and revenge. "Ladies," Walsh said, settling into a chair across from them, "Mrs. Hartwell has briefed me on the general nature of your situation. Before we proceed, I want to establish that anything discussed in this room is protected by attorney-client privilege and mutual confidentiality agreements." Elena nodded professionally. "Understood. We're prepared to sign whatever documentation is necessary." Once the preliminary legal formalities were completed, Victoria opened a folder that had been sitting closed in front of her. "I'm going to share something with you that could destroy my husband's career, my son's future, and quite possibly my own financial security." Madison felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of information?" "The kind that explains why Richard has been so desperate to maintain control of the company, why he's been increasingly paranoid about outside scrutiny, and why your sudden interest in corporate governance probably has him terrified." Victoria's voice carried a steel Madison had never heard before. "Richard has been embezzling money from company accounts for the past 3 years." The words hit the room like a physical force. Elena's pen stopped moving across her legal pad, and Madison felt the careful plans she'd been developing suddenly shift into an entirely different category of legal and ethical complexity. "What kind of embezzlement?" Elena asked, her lawyer's instincts immediately shifting into interrogation mode. Victoria spread several documents across the table: bank statements, transfer records, accounting summaries that painted a picture of systematic financial fraud. "He's been skimming money from client accounts, hiding losses through creative bookkeeping, and transferring company assets into personal investment vehicles that he controls exclusively." Madison examined the documents with growing horror and recognition. "These transactions, I've seen some of these in the quarterly reports. They were listed as strategic investments and operational expenses. Strategic investments in his personal stock portfolio, operational expenses for his gambling debts and mistresses." Victoria's voice carried the controlled fury of someone who had been betrayed systematically and deliberately. "The total amount missing from company accounts is approaching $2 million. Walsh leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mrs. Hartwell, you understand that this information creates significant legal obligations. If these allegations are accurate, we're talking about criminal fraud, not just civil matters." "I understand perfectly." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "I also understand that my husband has been systematically destroying the company that my family helped build, while creating a work environment that drives away talented employees and exposes the firm to massive liability lawsuits." Madison felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. "This explains the declining client base, the financial pressure, the increasingly desperate attempts to close new business. It also explains why Richard was so threatened By your presentation on Tuesday, Victoria continued. He needs the Meridian Holdings deal to succeed because he's running out of ways to hide the missing money. If that account doesn't close, the company's financial position becomes untenable. Elena was taking notes furiously, her legal mind clearly processing the implications. Victoria, if you've known about this embezzlement for months, why haven't you reported it to authorities? Victoria's smile was sharp as broken glass. Because I've been gathering evidence. Because I wanted to make sure that when I acted, the case would be absolutely bulletproof. And because I wanted to find the right allies before I declared war on my husband. The conference room fell silent as the full magnitude of Victoria's strategy became clear. She hadn't just been planning a divorce, she'd been preparing a comprehensive destruction of Richard's professional and personal life. What exactly are you proposing? Madison asked. I'm proposing that we combine our resources and our motivations, Victoria replied. You have ownership rights that give you legal standing to challenge Richard's leadership. I have evidence of criminal behavior that could send him to prison. Elena has the legal expertise to ensure we proceed correctly. Together, we have the power to remove Richard from the company permanently and rebuild it according to the principles it was supposedly founded on. Madison looked at Elena, seeing her own thoughts reflected in the lawyer's expression. This was far beyond what they had originally planned. They were no longer talking about workplace discrimination and corporate governance, but about criminal prosecution and the complete dismantling of Richard's life. The evidence you've gathered, Elena said carefully, would you be willing to turn it over to federal prosecutors? I would insist on it, Victoria replied. Richard needs to face consequences for what he's done, not just to the company, but to every employee whose career he's damaged and every client whose trust he's violated. Madison felt a moment of vertigo as she contemplated the full scope of what Victoria was proposing. Victoria, if we proceed with this, there's no going back. Richard won't just lose his job. He'll lose everything. Good. Victoria's voice carried no trace of doubt or regret. He's spent years taking everything from other people. It's time he experienced what that feels like. Walsh cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the practical considerations. Ladies, if we're going to proceed with this course of action, we need to establish a clear timeline and legal strategy. Criminal fraud investigations can take months or years, but corporate governance changes can be implemented much more quickly. Elena nodded, her strategic mind already working through the possibilities. We could initiate the corporate changes. First, remove Richard from his executive position and voting authority, then provide the criminal evidence to prosecutors once the company is secured. What about James? Madison asked, the question that had been haunting her since their conversation the previous day. How much does he know about his father's criminal activity? Victoria's expression softened slightly. James doesn't know anything about the embezzlement. He's been deliberately kept out of the financial operations, partly because Richard doesn't trust anyone with the full picture, and partly because James has been asking uncomfortable questions about company policies. Madison felt a surge of relief mixed with sadness. James was innocent of his father's crimes, but he would still be devastated by the revelation. Their conversation about family loyalty and personal choice would take on an entirely different meaning once the truth came out. There's something else you need to know, Victoria continued. Richard has been planning to name James as his successor within the next 6 months. He's been setting up the transition as a way of securing his own legacy and ensuring that someone loyal to him maintains control of the company. Even though James has been questioning company policies? Elena asked. Richard believes he can manipulate James into continuing his management approach. He thinks that blood loyalty will overcome moral objections. Victoria's voice carried a mother's protective fury. He's wrong. James is a better man than his father, but Richard is too narcissistic to recognize that. Madison felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Victoria was offering her the chance to completely destroy Richard Hartwell, not just professionally, but personally and legally. It was more revenge than she had ever imagined possible, more justice than she had dared to hope for. But it was also more responsibility than she had prepared for. Taking down Richard would mean assuming leadership of a company in crisis, rebuilding relationships with clients who had been misled, and somehow maintaining the trust of employees who would be shocked by the revelations about their former CEO. "Victoria," Madison said slowly, "if we proceed with this plan, what happens to you? To your divorce settlement, your financial security?" Victoria smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Madison had seen from her. "That's the beautiful part. As Richard's wife, I'm entitled to half of his legitimate assets. As a whistleblower in a criminal fraud case, I'm protected from retaliation. And as a board member with significant voting rights, I'll have a say in who leads the company, moving forward." The implication was clear. Victoria wasn't just offering to help Madison destroy Richard, she was positioning herself as a key ally in whatever came next. Elena looked up from her notes, her expression serious. "Madison, I need to ask you directly. Are you prepared for what this means? We're not just talking about challenging workplace discrimination anymore. We're talking about criminal prosecution, federal investigations, media attention, and the complete transformation of your life." Madison thought about her grandfather's letter, about his faith in her judgment and his trust in her moral compass. She thought about the employees like Sarah in accounts receivable, whose careers had been stunted by systematic discrimination. She thought about the clients who had trusted Hartwell Associates with their financial futures, unaware that their money was being stolen by the man charged with protecting it. And she thought about Richard's casual dismissal of her as just another blonde. The moment when years of accumulated injustice had crystallized into a determination to demand better. "I'm prepared," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "But I want to make sure we do this right. No shortcuts, no legal vulnerabilities, no innocent people caught in the crossfire." Victoria nodded approvingly. "Agreed, which means we need to coordinate our timing carefully." The board meets next Friday to discuss quarterly results and the Meridian Holdings proposal. If we're going to act, that would be the optimal moment. Elena was already calculating timelines. That gives us 8 days to prepare legal documentation, coordinate with prosecutors, and ensure we have all the evidence properly organized. 8 days to change everything, Madison said quietly. 8 days to fix everything, Victoria corrected. Richard has been destroying this company piece by piece for years. It's time someone with actual integrity took control. As the meeting concluded, and they began gathering documents, Madison felt the weight of history settling around her. In 8 days, she would walk into a board meeting as a relatively powerless employee and emerge as the leader of a major financial firm. She would transform from someone fighting for basic respect to someone responsible for an organization's future and the livelihoods of dozens of employees. Her grandfather had left her the tools for this transformation, but the courage to use them had to come from within. As she shook Victoria's hand and prepared to leave the law office, Madison realized that the scared young woman who had fled Richard's humiliation just a week ago was gone forever. In her place stood someone ready to prove that intelligence, integrity, and careful preparation could triumph over entitlement, corruption, and institutional prejudice. The war for Hartwell Associates was about to reach its decisive battle, and Madison Clarke intended to win. The boardroom of Hartwell Associates had witnessed countless decisions over its 30-year history: mergers that built fortunes, partnerships that shaped industries, strategic pivots that determined the fates of businesses and careers. But as Madison Clarke walked through the polished oak doors at exactly 2 p.m. on Friday afternoon, she carried with her the power to eclipse them all. The room itself seemed designed to intimidate, with its massive mahogany table, leather chairs that had probably cost more than most people's cars, and oil paintings of distinguished gentlemen whose stern gazes suggested they disapproved of anyone presumptuous enough to challenge established authority. Richard Hartwell sat at the head of the table like a king holding court, his expensive suit and practiced smile radiating the confidence of someone who had never seriously contemplated the possibility of defeat. "Ah, Madison," Richard said with false warmth as she entered. "I wasn't expecting you at today's board meeting." "I requested that Ms. Clarke attend," Victoria Hartwell said from her position halfway down the table, her voice carrying an edge that made several board members glance. Madison took the seat Elena had secured for her, strategically positioned across from Richard with a clear view of all board members. She set her leather portfolio on the table with deliberate care, noting how the soft sound seemed to command attention in the suddenly tense atmosphere. The other board members were already seated, James near his father, looking uncomfortable and avoiding Madison's eyes, Marcus Chen in an observer role along the wall, and 3 outside directors whose expressions ranged from curious to mildly annoyed at the delayed start. Elena sat near the back of the room, officially present as legal counsel but positioned to provide support when needed. "Well then," Richard continued, consulting his agenda with theatrical precision. "Let's begin with quarterly financial results. As you can see from the distributed reports, we've maintained strong profit margins despite challenging market conditions." Madison listened to Richard's presentation with the detached focus of someone analyzing a performance rather than absorbing information. She knew the real numbers, had spent the past week with Elena and Victoria poring over financial records that revealed the careful accounting manipulations and hidden transfers that made Richard's rosy projections possible. "Our client retention rates remain strong," Richard continued, "and the potential Meridian Holdings acquisition represents a significant growth opportunity that could position us for expanded market share in the coming fiscal year." Board member Harold Thornton, a silver-haired veteran of decades in investment banking, raised his hand. "Richard, I've been reviewing the client analysis Madison prepared for the Meridian presentation. Her projections seem more conservative than what you're presenting today." Madison felt the first stirring of opportunity. "Mr. Thornton, I'd be happy to address any questions about the financial modeling." "Actually," Richard interrupted smoothly, "I think we should focus on the broader strategic implications rather than getting bogged down in technical details." The dismissal was casual, but unmistakable. The same condescending tone that had triggered Madison's journey to this moment. She saw Elena's slight nod from across the room, the signal they had agreed upon. "Actually, Mr. Hartwell," Madison said, her voice carrying a calm authority that made Richard's eyebrows rise slightly, "I think the technical details are exactly what this board needs to understand." She opened her portfolio and withdrew a document that made Richard's face pale. The original partnership agreement between Thomas Clarke and Richard Hartwell, dated 1983. "Before we discuss future strategy, I think we need to clarify the current ownership structure of this company." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Madison could feel the attention of every person present focused on the document in her hands like a laser beam. "Madison," Richard said carefully, "I'm not sure what you think you're accomplishing, but this is neither the time nor the place for whatever grievance you're nursing." "This isn't about grievances, Mr. Hartwell. This is about corporate governance and fiduciary responsibility." Madison placed the document on the table where everyone could see it. "This is the original partnership agreement establishing Hartwell and Associates, signed by you and my grandfather, Thomas Clarke." James leaned forward, his face showing recognition and growing alarm. "Madison, what are you doing?" "I'm exercising my rights as a 30% shareholder in this company," Madison replied evenly. "Rights that have been in effect since my grandfather's death 3 years ago, administered through a family trust that apparently no one bothered to inform the current management about." The explosion of voices was immediate and chaotic. Board members demanded explanations. Richard began sputtering denials, and James looked like he'd been physically struck. Only Victoria remained calm, watching the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was finally bearing fruit. "That's impossible," Richard said, his voice rising above the commotion. "I bought out Thomas Clarke's interest in 1987. I have the documentation." "You have documentation of a partnership dissolution that transferred Thomas Clarke's equity into a family trust," Elena said, rising from her position at the back of the room. "As legal counsel for the Clarke Trust, I can confirm that Ms. Clarke is the legitimate holder of 30% of this company's outstanding shares." Elena moved to the table and began distributing copies of legal documents, trust agreements, stock transfer records, board resolutions that painted an undeniable picture of Madison's ownership position. "This is preposterous," Richard said. But Madison could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Even if these documents are legitimate, they don't give her the right to disrupt a board meeting with accusations and— The documents give me the right to call for a vote of no confidence in current leadership," Madison interrupted, "particularly when that leadership has been systematically violating their fiduciary duties to shareholders and employees." She reached into her portfolio again, this time withdrawing the evidence Victoria had provided: bank statements, transfer records, and accounting analysis that documented Richard's embezzlement with devastating precision. For the past 3 years, Richard Hartwell has been stealing money from company accounts, hiding losses through fraudulent bookkeeping, and using client funds for personal investments and expenses. The second wave of shock was even more intense than the first. Harold Thornton grabbed the financial documents with shaking hands, his experienced eyes immediately recognizing the patterns Madison was describing. The other outside directors clustered around him, their voices mixing in a crescendo of outrage and disbelief. "These are lies," Richard said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is a coordinated attack by a disgruntled employee who documented every instance of workplace harassment and discrimination over 5 years of employment?" Madison continued relentlessly. "Who discovered that the company's declining performance is directly related to management practices that drive away talent and expose the firm to massive liability?" She looked directly at Richard, allowing all of her accumulated anger and determination to show in her expression. "Who realized that a man who dismisses qualified professionals as just another blonde might not be the best person to lead a company built on client trust and employee expertise?" James stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Madison, stop. Whatever point you're trying to make, this isn't the way—" "James," Victoria said softly, her voice cutting through her son's protest like a knife. "Sit down and listen. Your father has been stealing money from this company and lying about it for years." The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet was heavy with the weight of irreversible revelation. James looked between his mother and father, his face cycling through confusion, denial, and dawning horror. "Mom," he said quietly, "what are you talking about?" Victoria reached into her own folder and withdrew additional documentation, bank records and personal financial statements that Elena had subpoenaed as part of the divorce proceedings. "I'm talking about $2 million in missing company funds. I'm talking about gambling debts your father has been covering with client money. I'm talking about investment losses he's been hiding through creative accounting." Victoria's voice remained steady, but Madison could see the pain behind her composed exterior. "I'm talking about the systematic destruction of everything this company was supposed to represent." Richard's facade finally cracked completely. "Victoria, you have no idea what you're talking about. The financial pressures, the market conditions, I did what was necessary to keep this company afloat." "You did what was necessary to maintain your lifestyle and ego," Victoria replied coldly, "while destroying the careers of talented employees and violating the trust of every client who believed their money was safe with Hartwell Associates." Harold Thornton looked up from the financial documents, his face grave. "Richard, These allegations are extremely serious. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at criminal fraud charges and massive civil liability. Criminal charges? James's voice was barely above a whisper. Elena stepped forward, her lawyer's instincts taking over. The evidence of embezzlement and fraudulent accounting practices has already been reviewed by federal prosecutors. Charges are likely to be filed within the next few days. The room erupted again, but this time the chaos was directed entirely at Richard. Board members demanded explanations he couldn't provide, asked questions he couldn't answer without incriminating himself further, and began discussing damage control measures that assumed his guilt rather than his innocence. Madison watched the destruction of Richard Hartwell's career with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was what she had worked toward for the past week, what her grandfather's legacy had made possible, what years of accumulated injustice had demanded. But seeing James's devastation, watching the complete collapse of everything Richard had built, she felt the weight of consequences she had set in motion. "I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in Richard Hartwell's leadership," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "And I nominate myself as interim CEO while the board conducts a comprehensive review of company operations and financial practices." "This is temporary insanity. You'll realize your mistake when..." "When what?" Madison asked quietly. "When the FBI finishes their investigation? When the clients learn their money has been stolen? When the employees discover that their career prospects have been systematically undermined by discrimination and incompetence?" Richard's eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment, Madison saw past his bluster and entitlement to the fear and desperation underneath. He was a man who had built his identity on power and control, and she had just taken both away from him permanently. "You think you've won," he said, his voice carrying a venom that made several board members flinch. "But you have no idea what it takes to run a company, to make the hard decisions, to maintain client relationships that took decades to build." Madison stood up, her movement commanding attention from everyone in the room. "You're right, Mr. Hartwell. I don't know everything about running a company, but I know enough not to steal from clients, discriminate against employees, or dismiss qualified professionals based on their appearance." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member in turn, "and I know enough to surround myself with competent advisors, to treat people with respect, and to base decisions on merit rather than personal loyalty or prejudice." Richard was escorted from the room by building security, his departure marking the end of an era and the beginning of something entirely different. As the remaining board members began discussing transition procedures and damage control measures, Madison felt the full weight of what she had accomplished settling on her shoulders. She had destroyed Richard Hartwell's career, exposed criminal behavior that would likely send him to prison, and assumed responsibility for a company in crisis. She had proven that intelligence and preparation could triumph over entitlement and corruption. But she had also fundamentally altered the lives of everyone in that room, including people she cared about. James approached her as the formal meeting concluded, his expression mixing hurt, anger, and something that might have been admiration. "I hope you're satisfied," he said quietly. "You've gotten everything you wanted." Madison looked at him, really looked at him, and felt her heart break a little. "No, James. I've gotten everything that was necessary. There's a difference." He nodded slowly, then walked away without another word, leaving Madison alone with the victory she had fought so hard to achieve and the loneliness that came with winning wars rather than hearts. The boardroom gradually emptied until only Madison, Victoria, and Elena remained. The three women who had orchestrated Richard Hartwell's downfall sat in silence for a moment, each processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "So," Victoria said finally, "how does it feel to be the youngest CEO in the history of Hartwell Associates?" Madison looked out the conference room windows at the city skyline, thinking about her grandfather's letter and his faith in her. Judgment. "Ask me in a year," she said, "when we see whether I can rebuild what Richard destroyed." Elena smiled, gathering her legal documents with the satisfaction of someone who had just won the most important case of her career. Something tells me this company is in much better hands than it's been in for a very long time. As they prepared to leave the boardroom, Madison realized that this moment, this victory, was both an ending and a beginning. She had proven that just another blonde could outthink, outmaneuver, and ultimately defeat a man who had underestimated her intelligence and determination. Now came the harder task, proving that she could build something better than what she had torn down. The silence in Madison's new office, Richard's former office, felt heavier than any sound she had ever experienced. 24 hours had passed since the board meeting that changed everything, and the mahogany desk that had once symbolized Richard Hartwell's authority now represented the weight of expectations she wasn't entirely sure she could meet. The office itself told the story of a man who had valued image over substance, expensive leather furniture that prioritized appearance over comfort, artwork chosen for its price tag rather than aesthetic value, and a bar cart stocked with liquors that cost more per bottle than most employees made in a week. Madison had already decided that most of it would have to go, replaced with furniture that reflected competence rather than ostentation. Her laptop displayed the morning's headlines, and none of them were kind. Financial firm CEO ousted in dramatic board coup. Embezzlement scandal rocks prestigious investment company. 28-year-old takes control of Hartwell Associates amid criminal investigation. The business press had picked up the story with the voracious appetite of sharks sensing blood in the water. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Elena entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and the look of someone who had spent the night fielding phone calls from reporters, federal prosecutors, and panicked clients. "Thought you might need this," Elena said, setting 1 cup on the desk. "Fair warning, there are at least a dozen reporters in the lobby, and our phone system crashed twice overnight from the volume of calls." Madison accepted the coffee gratefully, noting how Elena's usually impeccable appearance showed signs of strain. "How bad is it?" "Depends on your perspective. The FBI is treating us as cooperative witnesses rather than suspects, which is good. 3 major clients have requested meetings to discuss the security of their accounts, which is expected. And Richard's lawyer issued a statement claiming this is all a vindictive attack by disgruntled employees, which is predictable." Elena settled into one of the leather chairs facing the desk, her expression mixing exhaustion with grim satisfaction. On the positive side, the federal prosecutors are confident they have enough evidence for criminal charges. Richard's going to be indicted, probably within the week. "And James?" "No contact since yesterday. His phone goes straight to voicemail and he hasn't been seen at his apartment." Elena's voice softened with sympathy. "Madison, I know this is difficult, but you need to understand that James's reaction isn't your responsibility. You didn't create this situation. You just forced it into the open." Madison stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, thinking about the conversation she'd had with James just days earlier. His words about family loyalty and the cost of challenging established power seemed prophetic now, tinged with a pain she hadn't fully anticipated when she'd set these events in motion. "Have I become everything I used to hate about this place?" she asked quietly. "Ruthless, calculating, willing to destroy people to get what I want?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You've become someone willing to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. There's a difference, even if it doesn't always feel like one." Another knock interrupted them, and Dot Morrison entered with her usual purposeful efficiency. But something was different about the executive assistant's demeanor, a lightness that hadn't been there during Richard's tenure, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Ms. Clarke," Dot said, "there are several people who'd like to speak with you when you have time. Marcus Chen has requested a meeting about restructuring the analyst division. Sarah from Accounts Receivable is here with several other employees who want to discuss workplace policy changes, and..." Dot paused, her expression taking on a note of satisfaction that made Madison curious. "And Victoria Hartwell is in the conference room with a proposal she thinks you'll find interesting." Madison exchanged glances with Elena, both of them recognizing that Victoria's proposals tended to be far more comprehensive than the word suggested. "Send Victoria in first," Madison said. "And Dot? Thank you for everything you've done to make this possible." Dot's smile was radiant. "Miss Clarke, I've been waiting 23 years for someone to clean house around here. It's been my absolute pleasure." Victoria entered the office with the bearing of someone who had shed a tremendous burden overnight. Gone was the careful composure of a woman trapped in an impossible marriage. In its place was the confident stride of someone who had reclaimed control of her own life. "Madison," Victoria said, settling into the chair Elena had vacated, "we need to discuss the future of this company." "I assumed that's why you're here." Victoria opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. "I've spent the morning on the phone with the 3 largest institutional clients, pension funds and investment groups that represent about 40% of our total assets under management." Madison felt her stomach tighten. "And? And they're not pulling their money. Yet." Victoria's emphasis on the last word was unmistakable. "But they want assurances. They want to know that the new leadership has a plan for rebuilding trust and ensuring this kind of fraud never happens again." "What kind of assurances?" "Complete transparency in financial reporting, independent oversight of all client accounts, a comprehensive review of internal policies and procedures." Victoria leaned forward, her voice taking on the intensity of someone who had clearly given this considerable thought. "And they want to see concrete evidence that this company's culture is actually changing, not just its leadership." Madison nodded, recognizing the reasonable nature of the demands. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we use this crisis as an opportunity to rebuild Hartwell Associates as the kind of company it should have been from the beginning." Victoria spread the documents across the desk, organizational charts, policy proposals, and strategic plans that were clearly the product of considerable planning. A company where merit matters more than connections, where discrimination has real consequences, and where client trust is earned through competence rather than inherited through relationships. Elena leaned forward, studying the documents with professional interest. "Victoria, this is essentially a complete restructuring of the company's operations." "Exactly. Half measures won't restore client confidence or address the systemic problems that allowed Richard's behavior to continue unchecked for years." Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who had clearly thought through every aspect of her proposal. "We need to prove that this company has fundamentally changed, not just changed leadership." Madison examined the organizational charts, noting how Victoria had reimagined the company's structure to emphasize accountability and transparency. Department heads would report to multiple supervisors, financial oversight would be handled by independent auditors, and promotion decisions would be made by committees rather than individual executives. This would essentially eliminate the possibility of another Richard Hartwell situation, Madison observed. "That's the point. But it would also create opportunities for the kind of employees Richard's system excluded: women, minorities, people whose backgrounds didn't include the right schools or family connections." Victoria's smile was sharp with possibility. "Madison, we have the chance to prove that a company built on actual merit can outperform one built on privilege and prejudice." A knock at the door interrupted them, and James Hartwell entered. Without waiting for permission. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, his eyes carrying the hollow look of someone whose world had been fundamentally altered. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice directed at Madison, but his eyes including Victoria and Elena in the conversation. "James," Victoria said softly, "how are you holding up?" "How do you think I'm holding up?" The question came out, harsher than he'd probably intended. "My father is about to be arrested for embezzlement," My family's reputation is destroyed, and the woman I'm in love with orchestrated the entire thing. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Madison felt her heart constrict, but she forced herself to maintain the composure that her new position required. "James," she said carefully, "I know this is difficult." "Difficult?" James laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Madison, you've destroyed everything my family built. You've turned my mother against my father, exposed financial problems that could send him to prison, and taken control of a company that's been in our family for 30 years. Actually," Victoria said quietly, "the company was never just in your family. Madison's grandfather was an equal partner from the beginning. Your father's crime was making everyone forget that." James turned to his mother with an expression mixing hurt and betrayal. "You knew about this. You knew what she was planning, and you helped her. I knew your father was destroying this company and breaking the law. I knew he was creating a work environment that systematically excluded qualified people based on prejudice and favoritism." Victoria's voice remained steady, but Madison could see the pain behind her composed exterior. "James, I love you, but I won't protect your father from the consequences of his own choices." James sank into one of the leather chairs, his composure finally cracking completely. "Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that everything you believed about your father, your family, your entire life was built on lies and criminal behavior?" Madison felt a surge of sympathy mixed with her own complicated emotions. "James, I'm sorry you had to learn about your father's crimes this way, but you needed to learn about them. Everyone did." "Did they? Or did you just want revenge for what he said to you in that board meeting?" The accusation hit harder than Madison had expected, partly because it forced her to confront a question she'd been avoiding. How much of her campaign against Richard had been motivated by justice, and how much by personal vindication? "Both," she said finally, the honesty surprising even herself. "I wanted revenge. I wanted him to pay for years of dismissive comments and discriminatory behavior, but I also wanted to save this company from the damage his leadership was causing." Elena cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the practical considerations. "James, regardless of the motivations, the evidence of your father's criminal behavior is overwhelming. This situation would have come to light eventually. Madison just ensured it happened in a way that gave the company a chance to survive." James looked around the office, his father's former office, taking in the changes Madison had already begun implementing. The garish artwork had been removed, the expensive liquor bottles were gone, and the leather furniture had been rearranged to suggest collaboration rather than domination. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now we rebuild," Madison said. "We create the kind of company your grandfather and my grandfather originally envisioned. A place where competence matters more than connections, where client trust is earned rather than assumed, and where employees are judged by their contributions rather than their demographics." "And where do I fit into this new vision?" Madison had been dreading this question, knowing that her answer would determine not just James's professional future, but any possibility of personal reconciliation between them. "That depends on what you want," she said. "You can stay and help us rebuild, knowing that you'll be judged on your merits rather than your family name. Or you can leave and start fresh somewhere else, without the burden of your father's reputation." James was quiet for a long moment, processing the choice she'd presented. "What about us? Is there any possibility of salvaging something from the wreckage of our family's relationship?" Madison felt tears threatening, but forced them back. "James, I care about you. I probably always will. But I can't have a relationship with someone who sees my fight for justice as a personal betrayal. And I can't have a relationship with someone who destroyed my family to prove a point." The finality in his voice was like a door closing. Madison realized that this was the real cost of her victory, not just Richard's downfall, but the loss of any future with James. I understand, she said softly. James stood up, his movement carrying the weight of permanent decisions. I'll be submitting my resignation this afternoon. I think it's better for everyone if I start over somewhere else. James, Victoria said, you don't have to leave. This company needs people with integrity and intelligence. Maybe, but it doesn't need Richard Hartwell's son, and that's what I'll always be here. James looked at Madison one last time, his expression mixing sadness with something that might have been respect. I hope you're successful, Madison. I hope you prove that you can build something better than what my father created. After James left, the office fell silent except for the muted sounds of the city beyond the windows. Madison stared at the door he'd closed behind him, feeling the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Madison, Elena said gently, you did what you had to do. Did I? Or did I just prove that I'm as ruthless as the system I was trying to change? Victoria stood up and moved to the windows, looking out at the skyline with the expression of someone contemplating vast possibilities. Madison, my husband, spent 30 years building a company culture based on his own prejudices and limitations. You've just given us the chance to build something based on principles and merit. At the cost of destroying a family. At the cost of holding a criminal accountable for his crimes, Victoria corrected firmly. James will recover from this. He's a good man with genuine integrity. He'll find his way to a better life without his father's influence. Madison nodded, trying to convince herself that Victoria was right. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like possibilities waiting to be seized. A buzz from her intercom brought her back to immediate concerns. Dot's voice came through clearly. Ms. Clarke, Marcus Chen is here for his meeting about restructuring the analyst division. Also, the FBI agents investigating the embezzlement case would like to schedule a formal interview. Send Marcus in, Madison said, and schedule the FBI meeting for this afternoon. As Victoria gathered her documents and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Madison, for what it's worth, I think my son will eventually understand what you accomplished here. It may take time, but he's smart enough to recognize that you saved this company and possibly his own future. Elena remained after Victoria left, settling back into her chair with the expression of someone prepared for a long, strategic discussion. All right, she said. Let's talk about damage control and rebuilding. Because the next few weeks are going to determine whether Hartwell Associates survives this crisis or becomes a cautionary tale about corporate corruption. Madison pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes, her analytical mind automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. What's our priority list? First, client retention. We need to personally contact every major account holder and provide them with complete transparency about the financial irregularities and our corrective measures. Second, employee morale. The staff needs to understand that the changes we're implementing are permanent, not just crisis management. Elena paused, consulting her own notes. Third, legal exposure. We need to cooperate fully with federal investigators while protecting the company from liability claims. And fourth, public relations. The story in the business press needs to shift from embezzlement scandal to successful corporate reform. Madison nodded, adding items to her own list. What about operational changes? Victoria's restructuring proposal makes sense, but implementing it during a crisis could be destabilizing. Actually, I think the crisis gives us cover for rapid changes that would normally take years to implement. Clients and employees expect dramatic action after dramatic revelations. A knock at the door interrupted them, and Marcus Chen entered with an expression Madison hadn't seen before. Something mixing respect with genuine enthusiasm. Madison, he said, I wanted to personally congratulate you on yesterday's board meeting. What you accomplished was extraordinary. Madison studied his face, trying to read the motivation behind his praise. Thank you, Marcus. Dot mentioned you had ideas about restructuring the analyst division? Marcus settled into the chair James had vacated, his body language conveying the confidence of someone who had picked the winning side in a corporate battle. I've been thinking about how to rebuild our reputation with institutional clients, he said, opening a folder of his own. What if we created a new model for client services, one that emphasizes transparency, collaborative decision-making, and accountability at every level? For the next hour, Madison found herself engaged in the kind of strategic planning session she'd always imagined but never experienced under Richard's leadership. Marcus presented ideas that were genuinely innovative. Elena provided legal frameworks that would make implementation possible, and together they began sketching out a vision for what Hartwell Associates could become. As the morning progressed, other employees requested meetings, some seeking reassurance about job security, others proposing changes they'd been contemplating for years but had never dared suggest under the previous regime. Madison found herself energized by their enthusiasm, by the sense that she was unleashing potential that had been suppressed by Richard's autocratic leadership style. But underneath her professional excitement, she carried the weight of personal loss. Every success felt incomplete without James to share it with. Every triumph was shadowed by the knowledge that her victory had cost her the relationship she'd once hoped to rebuild. By afternoon, as she prepared for her FBI interview, Madison realized that she had accomplished everything she'd set out to do and lost something she'd never intended to sacrifice. She had proven that intelligence and preparation could triumph over privilege and corruption. She had demonstrated that just another blonde could outmaneuver and defeat a man who had systematically underestimated her capabilities. But she had also learned that justice and personal happiness don't always align, that doing the right thing sometimes requires sacrificing what you want most, and that victory in the corporate world could be as lonely as defeat. The war for Hartwell Associates was over. Now came the harder task of living with the consequences of winning it. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation that transformed her life, Madison Clarke stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, watching the evening shadows stretch across the city skyline. The view remained the same, but everything else about her world had changed in ways both profound and unexpected. The morning's Wall Street Journal lay open on her desk, featuring a story that would have been unthinkable during Richard Hartwell's tenure. Hartwell Associates named among best places to work for women in finance. The article highlighted the company's new promotion policies, mentorship programs, and zero-tolerance approach to workplace discrimination. It was exactly the kind of recognition Madison had dreamed of achieving. So why did success feel so complicated? A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Elena entered carrying a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses, her expression mixing celebration with concern. "Thought we should toast the journal article," Elena said, setting the glasses on the mahogany desk that had once symbolized Richard's authority and now represented Madison's vision for institutional change. "Should we be celebrating?" Madison asked, accepting a glass of champagne that she had no intention of drinking. 3 clients pulled their accounts this week, 2 board members are questioning our new policies, and the FBI investigation is dragging on longer than anyone expected. Elena settled into one of the leather chairs that Madison had kept from Richard's era. Not out of nostalgia, but because replacing furniture seemed less important than reforming company culture. "Madison, you've transformed this place from a discrimination lawsuit waiting to happen into a model for how financial firms should operate. Employee satisfaction is at an all-time high. We've recruited 4 exceptional analysts who would never have been hired under the old system, and our client retention rate is actually above industry average." Madison nodded, acknowledging the truth of Elena's assessment while still feeling the weight of unfinished business. "What about Richard's trial? Any updates from the prosecutor's office?" "Jury selection starts next week. His legal team is still trying to negotiate a plea bargain, but federal prosecutors aren't interested in anything less than significant prison time." Elena's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had helped build an airtight case. Madison, he's going away for years. The system actually worked this time. The words should have brought closure, but Madison found herself thinking about the human cost of justice. Richard's crimes were real and his punishment deserved, but she couldn't entirely escape the feeling that she had become someone she didn't recognize, someone capable of destroying lives with methodical precision. Elena, can I ask you something? Do you think I've changed? Since all of this started, I mean. Elena was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. You've become more careful about trusting people, more aware of how power works and how it can be misused. But the fundamental Madison Clarke, the woman who documented injustices for 5 years and refused to accept discrimination as inevitable, she's the same person. Sometimes I wonder if I've just become better at playing the same games Richard played. More sophisticated about it, maybe, but fundamentally the same. The difference, Elena said firmly, is that Richard used power to exclude and diminish people. You're using power to include and elevate them. The methods might look similar from a distance, but the intentions and outcomes are completely different. Their conversation was interrupted by Dot Morrison, who entered with the purposeful efficiency that had made her Madison's most trusted advisor during the transition. Ms. Clarke, there's someone here to see you. Says it's personal rather than business. Madison felt her pulse quicken, wondering if James had finally decided to break the silence that had stretched between them for months. Who is it? A young woman named Sarah Hendricks. Says she read about you in a business magazine. Madison exchanged glances with Elena, both of them recognizing that unexpected visitors often brought either opportunities or complications. Send her in, Madison said. Sarah Hendricks appeared to be in her mid-20s, with the earnest intensity of someone carrying a burden too heavy for her years. She wore a modest business suit that had probably cost a week's salary, and her handshake carried the firm confidence of someone determined to make a strong first impression. Ms. Clarke, Sarah said, thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know your time is valuable. Please, sit down. Dot mentioned you drove from Philadelphia? I did. I worked for Davidson Financial, a mid-sized investment firm where I've been experiencing the same kind of discrimination you wrote about in your Harvard Business Review article. Madison felt a familiar stirring of recognition and anger. The article Sarah referenced had been published 2 months ago, detailing the systemic patterns of workplace discrimination that had characterized her years at Hartwell Associates. It had generated hundreds of letters from women in similar situations. Tell me what's been happening. Sarah opened a folder that reminded Madison of her own meticulous documentation habits. For 3 years I've been watching male colleagues get promoted while my own advancement requests are dismissed. Last month, during a client presentation I'd spent weeks preparing, my supervisor interrupted me to say that perhaps we should let one of the men handle the technical details. And the echo of Madison's own experience was unmistakable. Elena leaned forward, her legal instincts engaging. Sarah, have you documented these incidents? Everyone. Dates, witnesses, email correspondence, performance reviews that praise my work while denying me advancement opportunities. Sarah's voice carried the controlled fury Madison remembered from her own journey. But the difference between my situation and Ms. Clarke's is that I don't have family trust funds or ownership stakes. I'm just another employee trying to prove that competence should matter more than gender. Madison studied Sarah's face, seeing her own younger self reflected in the woman's determined expression. What are you hoping to accomplish by coming here? I'm hoping to learn from someone who actually won, who proved that the system can be changed if you're smart enough and persistent enough. Sarah paused, her voice taking on a note of vulnerability. And I'm hoping to find out if there's room in your company for someone who believes in the same principles you're implementing here. The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Madison hadn't anticipated. She looked at Elena, seeing her own thoughts reflected in the lawyer's expression. Sarah, Madison said carefully, are you asking me for a job? I'm asking you for the chance to work somewhere that the changes you've made are real and permanent, where merit actually matters and discrimination has consequences. Sarah's voice strengthened with conviction. I've researched Hartwell Associates extensively. Your new policies, your promotion patterns, your client satisfaction rates. You've proven that a company built on actual equality can outperform one built on prejudice. Madison felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of purpose that went beyond her own career advancement or personal vindication. Sarah represented something larger than individual success. She represented the possibility that the changes Madison had fought for could extend beyond a single company to transform an entire industry. Elena, what does our analyst hiring timeline look like? We have budget approval for 2 additional positions, and the quality of applicants has improved dramatically since the policy changes took effect. Elena's smile suggested she understood the direction Madison's thoughts were taking. Someone with Sarah's background and documentation skills would be exactly what we're looking for. Madison stood up and moved to the windows, looking out at the city lights beginning to flicker on as evening deepened. Somewhere out there were hundreds of women like Sarah, documenting discrimination and fighting for recognition in environments that systematically excluded them. Sarah, if you were to join our team, what would you want to accomplish? Beyond proving myself professionally, I'd want to help you expand the model you've created here. Show other companies that businesses built on merit and inclusion actually perform better than those built on exclusion and favoritism. Sarah's voice carried the passion of someone who had found her mission. Ms. Clarke, you've proven that one determined woman can transform an entire company. Imagine what a team of determined women could do. The vision Sarah presented was both exciting and intimidating. Madison had focused so intensely on reforming Hartwell Associates that she hadn't considered the broader implications of her success. But now she could see the possibility of something larger, a movement that extended beyond her own company to challenge discrimination throughout the financial industry. There's something you should understand, Madison said, turning back to face Sarah. The changes we've made here came at significant personal cost. I lost relationships, made enemies, and had to become someone harder and more calculating than I'd ever intended to be. With respect, Ms. Clarke, the cost of not fighting is higher. I've spent 3 years watching qualified women get passed over, seeing talented colleagues leave the industry entirely, accepting that discrimination is just part of the business world. Sarah's voice carried the steel Madison recognized from her own journey. I'd rather pay the price of fighting than continue paying the price of silence. Elena cleared her throat, drawing their attention to practical considerations. If we're serious about expanding our impact beyond this company, we need to think strategically about how to approach it. Industry conferences, business school recruiting, partnerships with women's professional organizations. There are multiple ways to scale the model we've developed here. Madison felt the familiar excitement of strategic planning, but this time, it was different. Instead of plotting against entrenched power, she was imagining how to build something better and more inclusive. Sarah, I can't promise that working here will be easy. We're still dealing with clients who preferred the old system, board members who question our methods, and constant scrutiny from people waiting for us to fail. I understand, but I'd rather fail while fighting for something I believe in than succeed in a system that's fundamentally broken. The conviction in Sarah's voice reminded Madison of her grandfather's letters, of the faith he'd placed in her ability to use power responsibly and create positive change. All right, Madison said, making the decision that felt both inevitable and transformative. Elena, let's start the formal hiring process. And Sarah, I want you to put together a proposal for how we could mentor other women facing similar discrimination challenges. Sarah's smile was radiant. Ms. Clarke, you won't regret this. As Sarah left the office, Madison realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of success. For months, she had measured her victory in terms of Richard's defeat and her own advancement. But watching Sarah's hope and determination, she began to see that true success might be measured by how many other women could follow the path she had carved. "Elena," she said, "what if we created a formal program? A network of women in finance who share resources, document discrimination, and support each other through legal challenges." Elena's expression lit up with possibility. "You're talking about institutionalizing the kind of support system that made your success possible, creating a formal structure for what Victoria and I provided informally." Exactly. Sarah is right. If one determined woman can transform a company, imagine what a network of determined women could accomplish. They spent the next hour sketching out possibilities, their excitement building as they contemplated the broader implications of Madison's individual victory. But underneath her professional enthusiasm, Madison carried the weight of personal loss that success hadn't resolved. As Elena prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Madison, you know that James called me last week?" Madison felt her heart skip. "What did he say?" "He's been following the coverage of your reforms, the business articles, the industry recognition, the transformation of the company culture." Elena's voice was gentle. "He said he wanted me to know that he understands now what you were trying to accomplish, that he's proud of what you've built here, but not proud enough to reach out directly. Maybe he's not ready, or maybe he's waiting for you to make the first move." Elena smiled sadly. "Madison, you've proven that you can rebuild an entire company. Rebuilding a relationship might be easier than you think." After Elena left, Madison remained in her office long past normal business hours, processing the day's revelations and possibilities. Sarah's visit had reminded her that her journey from dismissed employee to transformative leader was part of a larger story, one that included thousands of women fighting similar battles in corporate environments across the country. But it had also highlighted the isolation that came with success. She had accomplished everything she'd set out to do, proven every point she'd wanted to make, and created the kind of workplace she'd always imagined. Yet the victory felt incomplete without someone to share it with who understood both the cost and the significance of what she'd achieved. The city lights sparkled beyond her windows like possibilities waiting to be seized. Madison realized that part 9 of her story wasn't an ending but a recognition. That true success wasn't measured by the enemies you defeated, but by the people you empowered to fight their own battles. Tomorrow, she would begin the work of building something larger than her own career, something that could transform an entire industry. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel both the satisfaction of victory and the loneliness of leadership, understanding that both were necessary, parts of the price she had chosen to pay. The reckoning was complete. Now came the work of building a legacy that extended far beyond her own remarkable journey from dismissed blonde to transformative leader. 1 year after the board meeting that changed everything, Madison Clarke stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in the Waldorf Astoria, looking out at an audience of 500 women who represented the future of finance. The annual Women in Finance Leadership Conference had invited her as the keynote speaker, and the introduction still rang in her ears. The woman who proved that true leadership isn't inherited, it's earned. The applause had been thunderous, but Madison felt the weight of expectation that came with being seen as a symbol rather than simply a person. She had become the face of corporate reform, the example other women pointed to when arguing that systemic change was possible. It was a responsibility she hadn't sought but had learned to embrace. 18 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. I was just another blonde in a board meeting, watching my expertise dismissed by a man who measured competence by gender and advancement by family connections. The audience was completely silent, 500 women leaning forward to hear a story many of them recognized from their own experiences. Today, Hartwell Associates has achieved something unprecedented in our industry, a workplace where merit actually determines advancement, where discrimination has genuine consequences, and where the phrase good cultural fit doesn't mean looks like the people who are already here. Madison paused, letting her eyes sweep across the audience. She saw young analysts who reminded her of Sarah Hendricks, mid-career professionals fighting battles similar to her own, and senior executives who had paved the way for women like her to even attempt such transformations. But I didn't accomplish this alone. Change isn't a solo performance. It's a symphony that requires every instrument to play its part. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Hartwell and Associates' current leadership team. Elena Vasquez now served as Chief Operating Officer. Sarah Hendricks had been promoted to Senior Analyst after just 10 months, and 3 other women held department head positions that had never been occupied by women during Richard's tenure. The real measure of institutional change isn't whether one woman can break through barriers, it's whether the barriers themselves are dismantled to create pathways for others. Madison felt a familiar surge of pride as she described the mentorship program they had launched, which now connected women across 50 financial firms with experienced advocates who helped them document discrimination and navigate career challenges. The network Elena had envisioned had grown beyond their wildest projections, creating a support system that transcended individual companies and industries. We've learned that documentation is power, that evidence speaks louder than accusations, and that systematic change requires systematic preparation. She advanced to financial slides showing Hartwell Associates' performance metrics, client satisfaction rates that exceeded industry standards, employee retention numbers that were the envy of competitors, and profit margins that proved diversity wasn't just morally right but economically advantageous. Companies that exclude talent based on demographics aren't just ethically wrong, they're competitively disadvantaged. When you systematically exclude half the population from leadership consideration, you're operating with half the available intelligence. The applause was enthusiastic, but Madison found herself thinking about the personal costs that success never entirely resolved. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces, women she had mentored, colleagues who had supported her journey, industry leaders who had become allies in the broader movement for change. But James wasn't there. She hadn't expected him to be, but his absence still felt like an empty space in her triumph. After the presentation, during the networking reception, Madison found herself surrounded by women wanting advice, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and seeking guidance on how to implement similar changes in their organizations. The conversations were energizing but also overwhelming, each woman representing another battle to be fought, another system to be reformed. Madison Clarke? The voice was tentative, almost hesitant. Madison turned to find a young woman who couldn't have been older than 25, holding a business card with trembling hands. I'm Jessica Park. I work for Morrison & Associates in Chicago. I wanted to thank you for your Harvard Business Review article. It gave me the courage to start documenting incidents in my own workplace. Madison accepted the business card, noting the careful penmanship and professional formatting. How's it going so far? Slowly, but I've connected with 3 other women in my firm who are having similar experiences. We're building evidence together, supporting each other through the process. Jessica's voice strengthened with determination. Your example showed us that change is possible if you're patient and strategic about it. These conversations continued. Throughout the evening, women sharing stories of small victories and systemic challenges, of progress measured in increments and setbacks that required renewed determination. Madison realized that her individual success had become part of a larger narrative about possibility and persistence. As the reception wound down, Madison stepped onto the hotel's terrace, needing a moment away from the crowd to process the evening's significance. The city spread out below her, millions of lights representing lives and dreams and aspirations that extended far beyond her own experience. Impressive speech. Madison turned to find Elena approaching with 2 glasses of wine and the satisfied expression of someone watching a carefully planned strategy reach fruition. "Think it made a difference?" Madison asked, accepting the wine gratefully. "Look at the reaction you got. Half the women in that ballroom are going to go back to their companies with new ideas about what's possible." Elena settled against the terrace railing, her voice mixing pride with amazement. "Madison, you've become exactly what your grandfather hoped you would. Someone who uses power to create opportunities for others." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the traffic patterns far below and reflecting on how much had changed since their first clandestine meeting at Café Moderne. "Elena, do you think we've actually fixed anything, or just created a temporary disruption in systems that will eventually revert to their original patterns? I think we've proven that change is possible, and sometimes that's enough to inspire other people to make it permanent." Elena smiled, her expression mixing wisdom with hope. "You can't control what happens after you're gone, but you can control whether you give others the tools and inspiration to continue the work." Madison's phone buzzed with a text message that made her heart stop. James Hartwell's name appeared on the screen for the first time in 8 months. "Watched your speech online. Dad's sentencing is next week. 3 years federal prison. I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were fighting for. You saved that company and probably saved me too. Congratulations on everything you've built." Madison stared at the message, feeling emotions she had spent months suppressing rising to the surface. Elena, reading over her shoulder, squeezed her arm gently. "Want to respond?" Madison thought about all the things she could say, all the conversations they had never finished, all the possibilities that remained unexplored. But she also thought about the women in the ballroom below, the mentorship network they had built, and the future they were creating for the next generation of female leaders. "Thank you. I hope you're building something good for yourself, too." It wasn't the conversation she might have wanted, but it was closure. James understood now what she had accomplished and why it had mattered. That recognition, even delayed, felt like a form of vindication she hadn't realized she needed. As Madison and Elena prepared to leave the terrace, Madison realized that this moment, standing above a city full of possibilities, surrounded by evidence of positive change, connected to a network of women fighting similar battles, represented the true measure of success. She had begun this journey as someone fighting for basic respect and recognition. She was ending it as someone who had transformed not just her own career, but the careers of hundreds of others. The phrase, "just another blonde," had become a symbol of underestimation overcome, of potential realized, and of systems changed through determination and strategic thinking. The new foundation was solid, built on principles rather than personalities, sustainable because it served justice rather than revenge. And somewhere in the city below, other women were beginning their own journeys from exclusion to empowerment, armed with documentation, supported by networks, and inspired by the knowledge that change was not just possible, but inevitable. Madison Clarke had become exactly what the world needed. Not just a successful woman, but a woman whose success created pathways for others to follow. The revolution was complete, but the evolution would continue long after she was gone. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.